Her mother's little house was so quiet that Della could hear the pendulum clock in the living room marking each beat 2:11 in the morning, 10 hours before she would walk down the aisle to become the wife of Clint Bradshaw. She had stayed the night here, the way so many brides do when they want to spend their last evening of girlhood beside their mother. She had risen only to pour a glass of water, her bare feet gliding over the worn floorboards she had polished since she was a child. For 27 years, Della had learned to be content with small things. A pair of hands roughened from cleaning other people's homes, a cramped rented apartment, an ailing mother she cared for with every dollar of a maid's wages. But tomorrow's wedding she had let herself believe it was a door. For the first time in her life, a man had told her he would take care of her. For the first time, she had allowed herself to dream. That was why, when her mother's phone buzzed on the kitchen table at 2:11 in the morning, Della only meant to silence it so her mother could sleep. But the name glowing on the screen froze her hand in midair. Clint, her fiancé, texting her mother. At this hour, she told herself there were 100 harmless reasons. A question about the flowers, about the seating. She had meant to set the phone down, she truly had, but her finger slid across the screen on its own, and the words opened like a door she should never have pushed. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about last night. I don't know how I'll get through tomorrow, Marin. The kitchen floor seemed to tilt beneath her heels. Della read it 3 times, trying to force those words into some innocent meaning, but they only lay there, cold and clear. She scrolled up, message after message, stretching back over weeks, over months, and with each line, the ground beneath her sank another inch. From her mother, last week. I know it's wrong, but when you look at me that way, I forget she's my own daughter. From Clint, last month. I'll marry her for everything she doesn't know, but the nights belong to you. Della's hands shook until the screen blurred. Then she looked up, and her eyes landed on the familiar leather jacket draped over the chair in her mother's room. Clint's jacket, the very one she had once helped him brush clean. On the table, 2 unwashed mugs, the faint, sweet scent of chamomile tea still clinging to the porcelain. The man who would hold her hand beneath the flowered arch in 10 hours had been here. Last night, in this house, the pieces of a sickening picture clicked into place, one by one. Why her mother had been so eager to choose every flower, try on every dress. Why Clint kept finding excuses to stop by and fix Mom's leaky faucet. Why, lately, her mother had been smiling more than the bride herself. Her own phone buzzed in the pocket of her robe. A new message. From Clint. Sleep well, my bride. Tomorrow is our day. Della stared at those words for a long time. Long enough for the screen to go dark on its own. She wanted to hurl the phone against the wall until it shattered. Instead, she wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, drew out her own phone, and began photographing each line, calm as a woman gathering evidence for a trial of her own. If they wanted a wedding, she would give them a wedding no one in that room would ever forget. She set the glass back exactly where it had been, eased her mother's door shut, and stepped out into the night. In 10 hours, she would still arrive at the altar, just not in the way anyone expected. 10 hours later, beneath an arch of white blossoms, amid the soft swell of a piano and 200 beaming faces, the minister smiled and spoke. If anyone objects to this union, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The hall fell into its customary polite hush. Clint gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a smug little smile at the corner of his mouth. Then Della let go of his hand. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply turned, slowly, toward the front row where her mother sat resplendent in an emerald green dress, and drew from the center of her bridal bouquet not a single rose, but a folded sheaf of papers. Her voice rang out, calm to the point of chilling, loud enough for the microphone clipped to the groom's lapel to catch every word. Before I say I do, I think everyone here deserves to hear what my mother and this man have been writing to each other, starting with last night. The smile froze on Clint's lips. Her mother's face went as white as the pages in her daughter's hand. Somewhere among the rows, a wine glass slipped and shattered, and in that very moment, the great wooden doors at the back of the hall swung open. A man in a dark coat stepped through, his stride unhurried, his eyes cold as steel. 200 heads turned at once. A wave of frightened whispering rippled through the room. The man this whole city dared only to name beneath its breath had just stepped into her chaotic world. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you'll never miss the healing stories still to come. To understand why Della was standing there, why that man had come, and why the worst day of her life would become the day that saved her, we must go back to what truly happened. Della's old car sat silently beneath the bare oak tree at the end of the road, about 2 blocks from her mother's house, where the weak yellow streetlight couldn't reach. She couldn't remember when she had turned off the engine. She only knew the cold had crept in through the cracks around the window, clinging to her skin like a thin layer of mist. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears seemed to have run dry from the moment she walked out of that door, leaving behind 2 unwashed mugs and a mother sleeping inside the lies of her own making. Della sat there, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring through the fogged glass toward the stretch of sky, slowly shifting from black into the silvery gray of dawn. In that silence, memory rose on its own, without asking permission. She remembered the nights when she was little, before her father left, when the whole family used to gather around the small wooden table, her mother humming softly while setting out dinner, and she had believed that a home was something everyone deserved to have. For 27 years after that, she had cleaned so many other people's homes, polished floors that weren't hers, folded sheets in rooms where she would never be allowed to sleep, and quietly, she had wished, just once, that there might be some place that belonged only to her, someone who would call her home. Clint had once been that small, fragile dream made real. He had once held her hand in the middle of the market and told her she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Now she understood that promise had been as hollow as the rooms she still swept clean at midnight. But Della wasn't the kind of woman who sat still and let pain swallow her whole. She had endured too much, bowed her head for too long, until she understood very clearly the difference between collapsing and getting back up. She took out her phone, opened the photographs she had taken again, and every line of every message was still there, cold and sharp beneath the glow of the screen. She wasn't going to let them disappear into a private argument behind a closed door, where her mother could sob and beg for forgiveness, and Clint could twist the truth into some other story. No, if they had chosen to betray her in the dark, then she would drag that truth into the light, in front of everyone who had been invited to witness her step into a lie. She started the car. The engine roared to life on the empty street, like a decision that had already been sealed. Della drove through intersections where yellow lights blinked, past the still dark windows of a sleeping city, until she found what she needed. An all-night print shop tucked beside a gas station, its white light spilling through dusty glass. The clerk on the night shift, a thin young man with sleepy eyes, glanced at her only once before lowering his gaze back to his phone. Della sat down at the old computer in the corner, connected her phone, and printed the pages one by one. She heard the printer humming as it pushed out the warm sheets of paper, each line from her mother, each word from Clint, appearing clearly on the white page, no longer streaks of light that could be swiped away on a screen, but something physical, something that could be held, something undeniable, something impossible to erase. When the final page slid out, she lifted the whole stack, feeling its weight in her palm, the weight of a truth finally exposed. She folded the pages carefully, neatly, the way one folds an important letter, then placed them inside her small handbag. Beyond the window, the sky had turned the pale pink of a new day rising, the day that should have been the happiest of her life. Della looked at her own blurred reflection in the glass of the cabinet, and the woman staring back at her was no longer the trembling bride from the night before. Those eyes had changed. There were no tears left in them, no pleading, only a cold, clear calm, bright as ice beneath the morning light. To understand why a wedding could carry the meaning of an entire doorway to salvation for Della, one would have to go back 3 months before that fateful night, to the mornings when she woke before the sky had even begun to lighten, while the whole city of Denver was still curled beneath warm blankets. Each of her days began with the earliest bus, carrying her through neighborhoods that grew more elegant with every mile, until the small houses gave way to towering iron gates, and lawns so wide she used to think they could swallow her rented apartment whole. The Kovac mansion sat at the end of a tree-shaded road, a massive gray stone building with windows as tall as the eyes of some giant creature silently watching. Della worked there 6 days a week, her hands submerged in soapy water from daybreak until sunset, scrubbing polished granite floors so bright she could see her own exhausted face reflected in them. Her fingers had grown calloused and cracked at the knuckles, her skin rough and dry from cleaning chemicals. The hands of a woman only 27 years old, yet looking as though they had labored through an entire lifetime. She dusted statues worth more than all the money she could earn in 10 years, polished bronze vessels whose price she never dared ask, and returned every object to its proper place, with the care of someone who knew that one small scratch could cost her a whole month's wages. That pay, after rent and bus fare were taken out, was barely enough for her to buy medicine for her mother. Marin had grown much weaker in recent years. Her lungs were no longer strong, and every prescription felt like an invisible hand draining Della's thin wallet dry. Della had never complained about it once, because she believed caring for her mother was her duty, the last remaining piece of the home she had once known. But her dignity, though worn down by all those years of bowing her back, had never truly shattered. One afternoon, while she was kneeling to clean a wine stain from the living room carpet, a guest of the household, a man in an expensive suit, with a face flushed red from drink, snapped his fingers at her, as though calling an animal. He ordered her to bring more wine, and before she could even rise and answer, he tipped the rest of his glass onto the carpet right in front of her and laughed, saying that cleaning was her job anyway, the only reason she existed in this world. The whole room went silent. Then a few faint giggles came from the other guests. Della didn't argue. She only bent quietly and took a cloth to blot the fresh spill, her hands steady even though her heart was trembling with humiliation. But when she lifted her head, there was none of the cringing submission that man had expected to see in her eyes, only a stillness so calm that the smile on his mouth slowly died, as if he were the one who had just been exposed. That was how Della survived, bending her back but never lowering her head, enduring without collapsing. And it was in those exhausting months, when Clint Bradshaw walked into her life with a warm smile and the promise that she would never again have to kneel and scrub floors for anyone, that she clung to that promise like a drowning woman clinging to the last piece of driftwood. To her, the wedding wasn't about a glittering dress or expensive bouquets. It was a promise of a room she would be allowed to call her own, a life where her hands could finally rest. She couldn't have known that the door she believed would lead her to freedom had in truth been built from the betrayal of the two people she trusted most. During all the months she worked in that mansion, there was one thing Della learned very quickly, even faster than how to wipe a stain clean from granite, or how to fold a bedsheet smooth and flat without a single wrinkle, and that was never to ask about the true owner of the house. The name Kovac was engraved on the iron gate, whispered through the long, endless corridors, but the man who carried that name had almost never appeared before her eyes. August Kovac, the servants called him, and each time that name was spoken, their voices dropped a notch lower, as though saying it too loudly could summon something out of the darkness. The housekeeper, an older woman with a stern face and eyes that missed nothing, was the first to teach Della the unwritten rules of the house. There was a room at the end of the east wing, its heavy oak door always shut, and Della was told in a voice that allowed no questions that she was absolutely never to set foot inside it, not even to dust. She had never seen what was inside that room, but sometimes, in the late afternoons, she heard voices drifting from behind the door, low male voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand, a tongue that sounded urgent and cold-edged, like knives scraping against stone. Those men were also part of the house, faces she gradually came to recognize, though never by name. They always wore dark suits cut to perfection, moved through the mansion with footsteps that made no sound, and their eyes were always sweeping every room, with a habit Della could only describe as belonging to men who were always waiting for the worst thing to happen. They never laughed, never made idle conversation, and whenever she carried a tray of coffee past them, they only gave a slight nod before continuing to stand guard beside the doors like statues that knew how to breathe. She heard the other servants tell stories during hurried lunch breaks in the kitchen, about phone calls that came in at midnight, about the way the entire mansion sometimes blazed with light at 3 o'clock in the morning, and sleek black cars glided silently into the courtyard, then vanished again before daylight. One young maid, who always liked to whisper frightening stories, once told Della that in this city, no one dared owe Mr. Kovac anything, whether money or a promise, because those who had done so all disappeared from the lives they had once known, not in the bloody way people liked to imagine, but far more quietly, as if the whole world had suddenly turned its back on them all at once, their jobs ruined, their friends avoiding them, every door slamming shut before their faces without a single explanation. Della didn't know how much of those stories was truth, and how much was fear embroidered through too many mouths, but she recognized that the fear itself was real. It lived in the way the housekeeper lowered her voice, in the tense vigilance of the men in suits, in the silence that settled over everything whenever that name was mentioned. And so, though she had never once seen the man's face, Della had learned how to fear his name, to fear it the way people fear a storm still far in the distance, an invisible power at whose edge she was only a tiny speck of dust drifting by. She lowered her head, did her work, and told herself that the less anyone noticed her, the safer she would be, that the people who lived behind forbidden doors and moved beside those men in suits belonged to a world entirely different from that of a maid like her, a world she never wanted and never imagined she would ever touch. The night Della first truly touched the world she had always tried to avoid came on a winter evening, when a sudden snowstorm swept in and forced the last buses to stop running, leaving her with no choice but to stay at the mansion later than usual and wait for the wind outside to settle. The enormous house had sunk into darkness, with only the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen, where she was quietly putting away the last of the plates. She thought she was the only one still awake, until she heard heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway, and a man stepped into the kitchen, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark overcoat with a few unmelted snowflakes still clinging to it. His face bore the weariness of someone who had just gone through something heavy, a faint scar running along the line of his jaw, and there was something in his eyes both cold and empty, like the surface of a frozen lake in the dead of night. Della didn't recognize him. In her mind at that moment, he was only one of the quiet men of the house, perhaps someone whose late shift had just ended, hungry and worn out. She did what anyone with an ordinary heart would have done. She asked whether he wanted something to eat. He looked up at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him such a simple question. Della didn't wait for an answer. She warmed the soup left over from dinner, sliced a few pieces of bread, poured a cup of hot tea, and set everything down before him on the wooden kitchen table, without the slightest trace of cringing, without a single probing word, simply as one human being caring for another on a bitterly cold night. He ate in silence, and she didn't break that silence either, only continued quietly finishing her work. When he thanked her, his voice was deep and hoarse, with an unexpected softness hidden inside it that she hadn't expected at all. They exchanged a few words, about the storm, about the cold, about small harmless things that meant nothing. And for the first time in months, Della felt as though she was being seen as a person instead of an invisible shadow made for cleaning. But that rare, peaceful moment was cut short when another man burst into the kitchen, one of the household's guests whom she had seen before, a man who always carried himself with arrogance because he had some measure of power. He began shouting, demanding to see someone, his tone overbearing and full of threat, until his eyes landed on the man sitting at the kitchen table, and Della witnessed something she would never forget. That quiet man merely set his teacup down with unhurried care, lifted his head, and spoke a single sentence in a voice so soft she could barely hear it. Yet the man who had been so aggressive only moments before suddenly went pale, his words choking off in his throat, his hands trembling, before he stammered an apology, and all but fled from the room, as if he had just realized he had accidentally stepped into the den of a beast everyone feared. It was in that very moment, when Della turned to look at the man who was calmly picking up his teacup again, that a new, icy fear began to creep into her chest. She looked at the scar on his face, looked at the way an entire arrogant man had collapsed because of a single quiet sentence, and the truth slowly rose in her mind like a dark shape emerging from the bottom of the water. The man for whom she had just laid out a simple late-night meal, the man she had treated with uncalculated kindness, was August Kovac himself, the name this whole city only dared speak under its breath, the true owner of the house, and of an entire world she had never dared step into. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear and blue it felt cruel, as though the entire universe were deliberately mocking what Della knew was about to happen. The bridal room on the upper floor of the banquet hall was filled with sunlight and the cheerful laughter of the bridesmaids, old friends who had no idea that the woman they were putting makeup on had stayed awake all night with a neatly folded stack of papers hidden deep inside her handbag. They gathered around her, one brushing her honey-brown hair into soft curls, another sweeping a layer of blush over her cheekbones to hide the pale exhaustion in her face, another admiring the white dress hanging beside the window like a beautiful ghost. Della sat still before the mirror, letting those hands fuss over her, and she watched everything through an entirely new lens, a lens cold and clear that the previous night had given her. She looked at her own face in the mirror, a perfect bride, and she almost found it absurd to think that only 24 hours earlier, that same face had still been bright with trust. Marin entered the room, radiant in the emerald dress she had spent weeks carefully choosing, and she came quickly to her daughter's side with all the tenderness of a mother on the most important day of her child's life. She smoothed a curl back into place for Della, her eyes shimmering with tears, her voice choking as she said how proud she was, how her daughter deserved every happiness in the world. Della looked into those eyes, the eyes she had once trusted more than anything else. And for the first time, she saw clearly the performance behind every tear, every loving gesture. She said nothing. She only smiled, a smile she herself hadn't expected she could perform so perfectly, and let that mother continue her play. Down in the hall, through the window, she could see Clint moving among the crowd of guests, shaking one person's hand, clapping another on the shoulder. A smug smile spread across the face she had once believed was trustworthy. He had insisted on a grand wedding, an event the whole city would talk about, even if it meant borrowing money and showing off far beyond what the two of them truly had. He had invited 200 guests, most of them business friends and acquaintances he wanted to impress, turning what should have been a day of love into a stage for his vanity. The entire banquet hall had been decorated lavishly, with an arch of pure white flowers raised at the ceremony platform, rows of chairs arranged neatly and stretching back, and at the front, a sound system carefully installed with large speakers placed on both sides, a small microphone already clipped to the groom's jacket, so that every vow would echo into the ears of every guest. Della looked at all of it, the stage Clint had worked so hard to build in honor of himself, and a cold thought swept through her mind that he had accidentally prepared the perfect auditorium for her, a stage where the truth would be spoken loudly and clearly enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. When she put on the wedding dress and saw her reflection in the long mirror, she no longer saw a bride, but a woman about to step into the light and reclaim what had been taken from her. She picked up the bridal bouquet, feeling the small but certain weight of the papers hidden among the rose petals, drew in a deep breath, and walked toward the door, ready for the moments ahead that she knew would change everything. The corridor leading down to the banquet hall was long and seemingly endless, and every step Della took across the red carpet seemed to stretch the distance between the woman she was trying to perform and the real woman screaming inside her. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, clutching the bridal bouquet tightly against her chest, and in that moment, all the iron resolve she had forged through the night suddenly wavered, because no matter how cruel what they had done might have been, the woman about to step forward and embrace her was still the woman who had given birth to her, who had stayed awake through so many nights when she was a sickly child, who had given her the best bite of food during the poorest years of their lives. Marin came toward her, her eyes once again shimmering with tears, and she wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter, her familiar warmth enclosing Della the way it always had for 27 years. She whispered in her ear that she should be happy, that from today on, a good man would protect her, that all her hardship had finally come to an end. Della stood still inside that embrace, and she felt as though her heart were being torn in two, one half wanting to bury her face in her mother's shoulder and burst into tears as she had when she was little, the other half turning cold as it remembered the lines lying silently among the flowers, the lines written in the dark by the very hand now caressing her. She answered her mother softly, her voice so calm that even she was surprised by herself, and when Marin let her go, Della looked at that face one last time, trying to find some trace of remorse, some flicker of hesitation, anything that might make her believe this was only a nightmare. But her mother only smiled, a radiant and complete smile, her performance perfect to the very last second. In the pocket of the coat draped over the back of a nearby chair, Della's phone vibrated softly, and she glanced over to see a new message from Clint on the screen, those falsely sweet words telling her that he was standing at the end of the aisle waiting for her, that he was the luckiest man in the world, that he loved her more than she could imagine. She read those lines and felt a bitter taste rise in her throat, because now she understood that those words were the same kind he had been pouring into her mother's ears on the nights when Della had believed she herself was being loved. She turned off the phone screen, drew in a deep breath, and slipped her hand between the flowers, checking one last time to make sure the stack of papers had been folded neatly and hidden well. The soft rose petals perfectly covered the cold, sharp truth beneath them, and no one could have guessed that the pure bridal bouquet was carrying an entire sentence within its heart. Piano music began to rise from the hall, the gentle notes announcing that the moment had arrived, and Della felt 200 people waiting for her beyond that door, waiting to witness a fairy tale they didn't know had already rotted from the inside. She placed her hand on the door, her palm icy cold, and in the final instant before pushing it open, a strange peace filled her, the peace of someone who had nothing left to lose, who had passed through pain and reached the other side of it, where only absolute clarity remained. She wasn't walking in to become a bride. She was walking in to tell the truth. And when the great wooden doors slowly opened before her, when the light from the banquet hall poured out and wrapped around her silhouette, Della Hayworth lifted her head, tightened her grip around the fateful bouquet in her hand, and took the first steps down a path that would carry her farther than any aisle she had ever imagined. Della opened the stack of papers in the thick silence of the hall, the rustle of paper sounding unmistakably clear through the speaker system, and she began to read, her voice steady, each word falling into the room like icy drops of water on the surface of a still lake. She read the message her mother had sent the week before, the confession that she knew she was wrong but still couldn't resist. That when that man looked at her, she had forgotten who her daughter was. She read Clint's reply, the cold, naked sentence that he would marry her for what she didn't know, while the nights belonged to her mother. With every sentence she read aloud, the entire hall shook another degree, horrified whispers rising and then dying away. 200 faces shifting from stunned silence to shock, from shock to disgust. Clint was the first to wake from the daze. He rushed toward her, his face twisted, shouting that she had gone insane, that all of this was nothing but lies from a jealous, delusional woman, that she was destroying the most beautiful day of her life. He turned toward the crowd, spreading his arms as he begged for sympathy, trying to salvage the polished shell he had worked so hard to build, his voice rising with injured outrage. But Della didn't flinch. She only raised the printed sheets high in the air, letting the raw evidence speak for itself, while holding up her phone screen to show the exact matching timestamps that left no room for denial. That undeniable truth filled the hall, slipping into every corner, and in that moment, every denial Clint had made collapsed into ruins. His face went deathly pale, his lips moved without producing a word, and the smugness that had once ruled that face was replaced by the raw panic of a man whose mask had just been stripped away before everyone he had wanted to impress. And Marin, the mother in the emerald dress, shot up from the front row, her trembling hands gripping the back of the chair, and then her legs gave way. She couldn't deny it, couldn't beg, couldn't do anything but bury her face in her hands as real tears. This time not tears performed for an audience, poured through her fingers. Her whole family, the relatives seated around her, drew away from her, as if pulling back from a flame, and loneliness closed over that woman in the middle of a sea of people who were staring at her with disbelief in their eyes. Della stood in the center of it all, between the man she had been about to marry, now frozen in silence, and the mother who had collapsed before everyone, and she felt no victory, no satisfaction, only a vast emptiness, and something else, something lighter, as though a burden she had carried for months had finally been set down. She folded the papers again, placed them together with the bridal bouquet on the small table beside the ceremony platform, and slipped the engagement ring off her finger, setting it on top, a quiet gesture more final than any words. She spoke one last time, her voice clear and calm, saying that she had come here today not to become anyone's wife, but to let everyone see the true faces of the two people they had gathered to bless. And just as those words ended, while the entire hall was still sunk in a shock unlike anything it had ever known, the man in the dark coat stepped fully inside, and every gaze, including Clint's stunned stare, was pulled toward the figure now approaching. But Clint, in the desperation of a man who had just watched his entire false world collapse in the span of a few short minutes, seemed not to notice the arrival of the man at the far end of the hall, or if he did notice, the rage blazing inside him had already swallowed whatever reason he had left. The polite mask he had worn for all those months had now fallen away completely, revealing the true face of a man who knew only how to blame and punish others for his own sins. He spun toward Della, his voice stripped of every trace of the false sweetness from before, turning shrill and venomous as he snarled that she was nothing, only a poor, lowly maid he had been generous enough to look at, that no decent man would ever bother noticing someone who had spent her whole life kneeling to scrub other people's floors. He humiliated her with the cruelest words he could think of, trying to drag her down as low as he himself was sinking, as though if he could make her hurt badly enough, he might recover some fragment of his shattered dignity. The whole hall went dead still before that naked cruelty. A few women lifted their hands to cover their mouths, a few men frowned, but no one dared to move. Della stood still and took every word, her face remaining strangely calm, and that very calmness only poured more oil onto the fire consuming Clint. He couldn't bear that she wasn't trembling, wasn't pleading, wasn't collapsing in the way he needed to see. And so, in an uncontrolled fit of rage, he strode toward her, his rough hand snatching her wrist and squeezing hard, yanking her toward him until his face was only a few inches from hers, his hot breath spilling out with threats that she would regret ever daring to shame him in front of everyone, that he would make sure she couldn't hold her head up in this city for another single day. Della's wrist throbbed beneath that brutal grip, but she didn't cry out, didn't struggle wildly, only looked straight into the bloodshot eyes of the man who had once promised to protect her for the rest of her life. And in that moment, she realized she was completely alone among 200 people. Not one person stepped forward. Her mother was still collapsed and sobbing in the front row. The guests stood rooted in place by fear, and the great crowd Clint had invited to show himself off had become nothing more than the motionless audience of a performance sliding toward violence. Della felt real fear rising in her chest. Not fear for her reputation or her future, but the primal fear of a powerless person being cornered by someone stronger, the fear she had known too well through an entire life spent bowing her head. She tried to pull her hand free, but his grip only tightened, and at the very second, when everything seemed about to slip beyond control, when Clint's twisted face was still pressed close to hers with all the threat of a man who had nothing left to lose, a low voice sounded from behind him, a voice that wasn't loud, wasn't hurried, but was calm enough to send a chill through the bones, a voice whose tone alone was enough to freeze the entire hall and make the hand clamped around Della's wrist stop halfway. August Kovac said only one sentence, telling Clint to let go of that woman, and his voice was so soft that the people seated in the very last row had to hold their breath to hear it. Yet it still spread through the hall like a current of cold air seeping into the marrow of every bone. Clint spun around, ready to pour his fury onto whoever had dared interfere. But the instant his eyes met the face of the man in the dark coat, every trace of aggression on his face vanished like snow before fire. He recognized that name, the name this whole city only dared whisper, and the blood seemed to drain from his face in a single instant. The hand gripping Della's wrist loosened at once, trembling, as if it had just touched something burning hot. August didn't take another step closer, didn't raise a hand, didn't raise his voice. He only stood there, both hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes cold as steel, and fixed straight on Clint. And that absolute stillness was more frightening than any shouted threat could ever have been. He spoke again, slowly, saying that a real man never had to use strength against a woman to prove himself, that what Clint had just revealed in front of everyone wasn't power, but the deepest cowardice of a small and ordinary man. Every word he spoke was calm and clear, but each one cut into Clint more deeply than any blade, because they were spoken by a man everyone in that room knew was capable of turning every word into reality. Clint stammered something, trying to salvage the last shred of his dignity, but August only inclined his head slightly toward the two men in dark suits who had silently appeared at the doorway, and that tiny gesture alone was enough to make Clint fall silent. Stepping back one pace at a time, his face white with terror, the whole hall watched in absolute speechlessness. 200 people witnessing the man who had been raging and threatening only moments before, now shrinking back like a child caught in the act, and they understood that the balance of power in that room had completely changed in the span of a few short seconds. Only then did August finally take his eyes off Clint, and when he turned to look at Della, all the icy coldness on his face softened in a strange and quiet way. He stepped to her side, removed his dark coat, and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders, a simple gesture so warm that Della's throat tightened. He asked if she was all right. His voice now returned to the deep, warm tone she had once heard in the kitchen on that snowstorm night, and Della suddenly realized that the man this entire city feared was the only one among all 200 people there who had stepped forward to protect her. She couldn't speak. She only nodded faintly, and he held out his hand, not to command her or force her, but like a silent invitation, telling her she didn't have to remain in that place for even one more second. Della placed her calloused hand in his palm, and for the first time in all 27 years of her life, she felt protected, felt what it was like to stand behind someone instead of always having to fight everything alone. Together, they walked between the rows of chairs, past the stunned faces of 200 guests, past the mother still bent over and sobbing and the man who had just been stripped of every ounce of power, and when the great doors of the banquet hall closed behind them, Della left behind not only a broken wedding, but also the old life of endurance she had been living for far too long. What happened to Clint Bradshaw in the days that followed was the clearest proof of how real power worked, not through fists or shouting, but through things so quiet and cold that the victim didn't even realize he was being dragged under until he had already hit bottom. August Kovac didn't need to lay a single finger on Clint. He only had to make a few calls from the forbidden room at the end of the mansion's east wing, speak a few low words to people powerful enough to shift an entire city. And then the wheels began to turn. The auto repair shop Clint had always been so proud of, the one piece of property that proved the successful man's image he had worked so hard to build, was suddenly seized by the bank within only a few days. Loans that had once been extended easily were now called in all at once, without a single word of negotiation. His regular customers suddenly stopped coming back. The business partners who had once eagerly shaken his hand now avoided him as if he carried a plague. His phone calls were no longer answered by anyone. The city Clint had once believed he could swagger through, the place where he had invited 200 people to witness his own glory, now turned its back on him all at once and with merciless coldness. Every door slammed shut in his face without anyone offering an explanation, because no one dared stand with a man who had offended someone bearing the Kovac name. The story of the exposure at the wedding also spread everywhere with the speed of wildfire, and before long, the name Clint Bradshaw became synonymous with betrayal and cowardice. No woman wanted anything to do with him anymore. No man wanted to do business with him anymore. Within only a few short weeks, the man who had arrogantly threatened to make sure Della couldn't hold her head up in that city became the one forced to lower his own head and avoid everyone's gaze, losing his career, losing his honor, losing the false world he had built out of lies. Della knew nothing about any of it until she happened to hear it from old acquaintances, and when the truth gradually became clear, she didn't feel pleased or triumphant, as she had once imagined she might in the most painful hours of her life. Instead, she felt only a strange peace, as though the universe had finally set its own order right again. She understood that this was August's way of returning justice to her, a kind of justice that needed no violence, no solemn promises, only the simple act of letting the man who had sown the wind reap the storm he himself had created. And while Clint slowly sank into the darkness of the rejection he had brought upon himself, Della began to realize that the man who had quietly cleared away the wreckage of her old life had asked for nothing in return, not one reminder, not one gesture meant to claim credit. He had simply done what he believed was right, then stepped back into the familiar darkness of his own world, leaving her to stand firmly on her own 2 feet. And it was that quiet, uncalculated part of him that unsettled her more than anything else, because it was the complete opposite of everything she had been taught to believe about people who lived in a world of power and shadows like his. That night, after August quietly had someone drive her all the way home, Della stepped into her cramped, rented apartment and stood motionless in the familiar darkness, still wearing his coat over her shoulders, still dressed in the wedding gown that now looked like a lost and meaningless white shell. She switched on the light, and the weak yellow glow fell over everything that remained of a life she had believed was about to turn a new page. On the small table pushed against the wall, the wedding gifts her friends had sent earlier were still neatly arranged, those boxes wrapped in glittering paper, now becoming cruel reminders of a future that had never truly existed. Beside them lay the album she had carefully prepared, the photographs of her and Clint taken during the days when she had still believed in his promises, and a long list of plans for married life that she had written with all the naive hope in her heart. Della took off the wedding dress, folded it, and placed it on the chair in the corner of the room, her hands still steady, her face still calm, just as it had been through that entire long, horrifying day. She had kept that composure in front of 200 people, had stood with her back straight while reading the words of betrayal aloud, hadn't shed a single tear when Clint humiliated her, had walked out of the banquet hall with her head held high. But now, when she was alone in the silent apartment, with no one left for whom she had to be strong, no stage left on which to perform, no eyes watching her, the armor of resilience she had forced herself to hold together since 2:11 in the morning the day before finally began to crack. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her calloused hands resting on her knees, and stared into the empty space before her, where tonight should have been the first night of a new life. And then, slowly, like a levee that had held back too much for too long finally breaking open, tears began to roll down her cheeks. She didn't cry because she missed Clint, because she understood that she had never truly lost anything precious in him. She cried for herself, for the girl who had dared to allow herself to dream once in her life and then been punished for that dream, for the daughter who had placed her trust in the 2 people she loved most, only to be betrayed by both of them in the dark. She cried for all the years of bowing her head, for the hands that had become calloused far too early, for the mother she had just lost, not through death, but through something even more painful than death, deceit. Sobs broke from her chest, rushing out, impossible to hold back, and she let them pour through her, because she knew this was what she needed, that a person couldn't stay strong forever without once being allowed to fall apart. She cried until there were no tears left to cry, until her exhausted body sank into a broken sleep right there on the small bed. And in the final worn-out moment before she drifted off, a vague thought passed through her mind, that perhaps sometimes a person had to let their whole world collapse completely before they could begin building something that truly belonged to them. The days that followed passed in a strange silence, and then strange things began happening to Della one by one, so quietly that at first she didn't even realize it. One morning, when she arrived at the hospital where her mother still had to go from time to time for treatment, the employee at the cashier's desk looked at her with confusion and informed her that all of Marin's medical expenses, including the old debts Della had been struggling to pay in installments for months, had been paid in full by an anonymous person. Della froze at the counter, unable to believe her own ears, because that amount of money was so large that even if she worked herself to exhaustion for several more years, she still might not have been able to pay it off. A few days later, a letter arrived at her apartment, an invitation to work at a small, quiet library in the city, a decent job with a livable wage and respectable hours, a job where her calloused hands would no longer have to soak in soapy water from dawn until deep into the night. The library manager said she had been recommended by someone reputable, but when Della pressed her to say who it was, the woman only smiled and shook her head. Della wasn't naive. She had lived too long in a world where nothing was ever given for free, where every kindness came with a price, and the more she thought about everything that was happening to her, the heavier her heart became with unease. She knew exactly who was behind all of this, and it was that silent generosity that frightened her, because she couldn't understand why a man as powerful as August Kovac would go out of his way to help a poor, lowly maid who owed him nothing, unless he was expecting something from her. That fear grew until she could no longer bear it, and one afternoon, she gathered all her courage and went to the mansion, stood before the man the whole city feared, and asked him directly what he wanted from her in exchange for everything he had done. August looked up at her from behind the large desk, and for a brief moment, something passed through his eyes, a very small hurt she hadn't expected, as if her question had touched some hidden wound deep inside him. He slowly stood, walked closer to her, and said in that familiar deep, warm voice that she had grown so used to every kindness, having a price that she could no longer believe there was such a thing in this world as kindness without conditions. He said he needed nothing from her, that he had helped her not because he wanted to buy her or possess her, but simply because he couldn't stand by and watch a decent person be crushed by life one more time. Della looked into those eyes, trying to find some sign of a lie, some hidden calculation, anything that might confirm her suspicion, but she found nothing except a strange sincerity and a deep loneliness she had never seen in anyone with so much power. She quietly asked him why her out of all the people in the world, and August fell silent for a long while, his gaze drifting out the window toward some distant place in the past, before he answered softly that perhaps it was time he told her a story he had never told anyone else. August invited her to sit in the chair by the window, and he stood there with his back turned to her, his gaze fixed on the vast garden slowly sinking into twilight, and he began to speak in a low voice entirely different from the cold authority she was used to seeing in him. He told her that he hadn't been born into silk and luxury as people liked to whisper, that when he was a child, he had once lived with his mother in cramped attic rooms inside the homes of wealthy people, because his mother, much like Della now, had once been a maid, a gentle woman who had spent her entire life cleaning, cooking, and serving people who saw her as nothing more than an object. He told her that he had grown up in cold kitchen corners, had watched his mother be scolded for mistakes she hadn't made, cheated out of her wages, humiliated in front of guests simply so the homeowners could amuse themselves, and she had gritted her teeth and endured all of it, day after day, year after year, only so he could have food to eat and a roof over his head. His voice trembled faintly when he spoke of the winter night, when he was 12 years old, when his mother fell gravely ill but still forced her exhausted body to go to work because she was afraid of losing her job, and those wealthy employers, instead of calling a doctor for her, threw her out of the house in the middle of the night simply because she no longer had enough strength to finish her work. leaving mother and son huddled outside the gate in the falling snow. He told her that his mother never truly recovered after that night, that she passed away while he was still only a boy, taking with her a whole lifetime of humiliation without ever once being treated like a human being. And from that pain, from the helplessness of a child forced to stand and watch his mother be trampled while he could do nothing, he had sworn to himself that he would become so powerful no one would ever be able to look down on him, or on any other powerless person, again. He had built everything he had today, even the empire of power that made the whole city tremble, not from greed or cruelty as people believed, but from the deep, gaping wound of a boy who had lost his mother to the indifference of the strong. He turned back to look at Della, and for the first time, she saw something deeply human glistening in those steel-colored eyes. He said that on the snowstorm night, when she had set out a late-night meal for him, without knowing who he was, without probing, without cringing, simply treating him with ordinary kindness, he had seen in her the image of his mother from long ago, the unshakable dignity of a person who still managed to keep her goodness, even when the whole world treated her unfairly. He said that when he saw Clint grab her and humiliate her in the middle of that hall that day, he had seen again everything he had once been forced to witness helplessly in his childhood, and this time, he hadn't allowed himself to stand still again. Della sat in stunned silence, tears running down her cheeks before she even realized it, because now she understood that the man whose name this whole city spoke in fear was in truth carrying inside his chest the heart of a little boy who was still mourning his lost mother, and the help he had given her had never been an act of charity, but his way of reaching out to the pain of his own past. After the afternoon when August told her the story of his life, something between them quietly changed, and the meetings that followed no longer carried the shape of an employer and an employee, but slowly became quiet moments that both of them treasured, though neither ever said it aloud. One evening, August invited her to the mansion, and when Della stepped inside, she was surprised not to see the usual servants or the men in suits, but only him standing in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, awkwardly trying to manage the pots and pans. He said he wanted to cook a meal for her with his own hands, to repay the late-night meal she had set out for him on that snowstorm night. And even though the food he made was far from perfect, the sauce a little too salty, and the meat slightly burned at the edges, Della still felt it was the finest meal she had ever tasted in her entire life, because she understood all the tenderness hidden behind the clumsiness of a man who had never been used to caring for anyone. They sat and ate together at the simple wooden table in the kitchen, the very table where they had first spoken to each other, and August said very little, because he had never been good at putting gentle things into words. But every gesture of his, the way he poured more water for her, the way he quietly pushed the plate of food closer to her, said all the things he couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. Then, when the meal was nearly over, he placed a small old box on the table in front of her, and when Della opened it, she went still, because lying inside was her father's silver pocket watch, the only keepsake her mother had ever kept from the man who had left their family, the very thing Della had been forced to sell years earlier in her most desperate days to buy medicine for her mother, the thing she had painfully accepted she would never see again. She couldn't understand how he had managed to find it after all those years, tracing it through who knew how many buyers and sellers, and when she looked up at him with tear-blurred eyes, August only gave a small shrug and said in a calm voice, trying to hide his embarrassment, that he had found it by chance, though both of them knew there was nothing accidental about the way he had gone to such lengths to return to her a piece of memory she had believed was lost. Della held the watch against her chest, feeling the familiar chill of the silver casing she hadn't touched in so many years, and in that moment, she realized that this man hadn't given her gold or expensive gifts to display his wealth. He had given her back a part of her own past, a part of herself she had thought was gone forever. She understood that this was what real love was, not the beautiful, hollow promises Clint had once poured into her ears, but quiet understanding, the act of someone caring about the smallest things she cherished. And for the first time since that fateful night, Della felt her heart, so hardened and guarded for so long, open a small crack to welcome a new light she had never dared to hope for. The call came at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, cutting through Della's restless sleep with a shrill ring that seemed to carry bad news before a single word was spoken, and the trembling voice of the neighbor who had been looking after her mother said over the phone that Marin had collapsed, that her breathing was growing weaker, and that her lips had turned blue. Della shot up from the bed, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't fasten the buttons of her shirt, and in that panic, the first person she thought of, the only person she called, was August. He answered on the very first ring, though it was the middle of the night, and within 15 minutes, his car was parked in front of her apartment, its headlights tearing through the darkness. He didn't ask long questions, didn't offer a single word of reproach about the impossible hour. He only opened the car door for her and drove into the night with all the calm of a man who understood that in moments like this, what another person needed wasn't words, but action. All the way to the hospital, Della sat curled in the seat, her hands clenched tightly together, and August placed one hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, a silent gesture telling her she didn't have to face this alone. When they rushed into the emergency room, the doctors hurriedly pushed Marin's stretcher through doors Della wasn't allowed to enter, and she stood there, helpless in the cold hospital corridor, watching the mother who had betrayed her disappear behind those doors. And she realized that no matter what her mother had done, no matter how her heart was still bleeding from that lie, she still couldn't bear the thought of losing her forever. The hours of waiting that followed passed like centuries, and August sat beside her through that entire endless stretch of time, not leaving for even a minute, not once looking at his watch or showing impatience. He was simply there in silence, bringing her a cup of hot coffee she never touched, draping his coat over her shoulders when she began to tremble from cold and fear. Della sat there, facing the most terrible conflict in her heart, torn between the wounded daughter who still held on to resentment and the child who still loved her mother with everything buried deepest inside her. And she broke down sobbing, confessing to August how terrified she was, how much she hated what her mother had done but still couldn't hate her mother herself. How if Marin died tonight, Della would have to carry an ocean of unsaid things with her for the rest of her life. August didn't try to comfort her with empty phrases. He only tightened his hand around hers and said softly that love and pain could always exist together inside one heart, that the fact that she still loved her mother despite everything wasn't weakness, but proof of a soul more beautiful than the wounds it had been forced to carry. When dawn began to break outside the hospital window, the doctor finally came out, his face exhausted but lit by a faint trace of hope, and he told them that Marin had survived the critical danger, that she would live, though she would need a long time to recover. Della buckled with relief, and August caught her, holding her in his arms in the quiet hospital corridor, letting her cry out all the fear that had been trapped inside her through the long night. And it was in that moment, when she lifted her head and looked at the man who had stayed awake beside her all night, who had driven through the darkness for her, who had remained for no reason other than that he wanted to be there, that Della understood August Kovac had chosen her, not through beautiful declarations, but through his steady presence on the darkest night of her life, and that this was the true shape of a love she had never known before. A few days later, when Marin was alert enough to sit up with her back resting against the pillows, Della stepped into the hospital room filled with morning sunlight, and for the first time since that fateful night, mother and daughter truly faced each other, with no roles left to play, no masks left between them, only two human beings, and all the raw wounds lying bare in the space they shared. Marin looked at her daughter as she came in, and her eyes, already sunken from illness, immediately filled with tears, because she understood that Della still coming here, still staying beside her through the edge of death, was something she didn't deserve to receive. She tried to speak, her voice weak and broken, and she began to say everything she had buried inside her heart for all those months. She confessed that she had no excuse for what she had done, that she knew it was an unforgivable sin, that for so many nights she had lain awake in disgust at herself. She told Della that after Della's father left them, she had lived all those years in loneliness and in the feeling that she had become invisible, an aging woman whom life had left behind, and when Clint began to notice her, giving her the attention she had longed for over so much time, she had weakened in a shameful way, allowing loneliness and the fear of growing old to swallow her conscience whole. She said she had hated herself in every moment, that countless times she had meant to stop, meant to confess everything to her daughter, but cowardice and shame kept dragging her deeper into the mire she herself had created, until there was no way back. She took Della's calloused hand in her trembling fingers, and she begged not for forgiveness, because she knew she had no right to ask for that, but only asked her daughter to believe that the love she had for her had always been real, that no matter how far she had fallen, Della had always been the most precious thing in her dark life. Della stood there, listening to every word of her mother's confession, and inside her was a fierce, tearing storm. On one side, the pain and rage still intact, the image of two unwashed mugs and the coat draped over the back of a chair still haunting her every night. On the other side, the thin, sickly woman before her, the woman who had given birth to her, who had loved her in her own twisted and imperfect way, the woman Della had almost lost forever only a few nights before. She thought of what August had told her during that long night at the hospital, that love and pain could always exist together inside one heart, and she realized she was standing before the most important crossroads of her life. On one side was the road of hatred, where she could clutch tightly to her pain and turn it into a wall that would separate mother and daughter forever. On the other side was the road of letting go, a road far rougher and far more difficult, but perhaps the only road that could lead her to true peace. She couldn't say the words of forgiveness right then, because some wounds are too deep to heal in a single morning or afternoon, and she didn't want to lie to her own heart with easy words. But she did something she herself hadn't expected. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and instead of pulling her hand away, she let her hand remain in her mother's, a small gesture carrying a silent promise that the door between them, no matter how deeply cracked it had become, had not yet closed completely. In the weeks that followed, as Marin slowly recovered and was taken to a small, quiet house to rest, Della continued to visit her regularly, and each time she went, she carried inside her the silent battle between old pain and the longing to be freed from it. She realized that for all those weeks, she had been living with an invisible stone pressing down on her chest, a burden of hatred and bitterness that she had thought was a way to punish her mother. But little by little, she came to understand a more bitter truth, that the only person being crushed beneath that stone every day wasn't Marin, but Della herself. Every night she lay awake, clutching her resentment. Every time she let the image of that night of betrayal gnaw at her soul, she was binding herself even more tightly to the past, allowing the two people who had hurt her to keep imprisoning her heart even when they were no longer present in her life. She thought of August, of the way he had carried the wound of losing his mother for so many years, and turned it not into blind hatred, but into a vow to protect the powerless, and she wondered whether she herself could find some way to set her own burden down. Then, one afternoon, as she sat beside her mother's bed, quietly watching the aging woman dozing with traces of illness and remorse etched across her face, Della finally understood that forgiveness didn't mean she had to forget what had happened, didn't mean she accepted or excused what her mother had done, and didn't mean her mother deserved to receive it. Forgiveness, she realized, was a gift she gave to herself, the only way she could remove the chain binding her to pain and move forward toward a free life. When Marin woke, Della took her hand, and this time she was the one who tightened her grip first, then softly told her mother that she still couldn't forget, that what had happened would always remain a scar inside her heart, but she had chosen not to let that scar define who she was, or poison the rest of her life. She said she forgave her mother, not because what her mother had done could be erased, but because she didn't want to carry hatred for another day, because she wanted to be free, and because despite everything, Marin was still her mother. Marin broke down sobbing, tears of true remorse streaming down her gaunt face, and she held her daughter, whispering words of gratitude through choked breaths, understanding that she had just been given a grace far greater than anything she had dared to dream of. When Della stepped out of the small house that evening, she felt her chest grow strangely light, as if the invisible stone that had weighed on her for all those months had finally been lifted away, and for the first time since that night at 2:11 in the morning, she could draw a deep breath without feeling a sharp ache in her heart. She lifted her head and looked up at the evening sky turning soft shades of orange, and she understood that a person's true dignity didn't lie in whether they had been betrayed or trampled, because sometimes that was beyond their control, but in how they chose to rise after all of it, in whether they allowed pain to turn them bitter, or chose to step through it and hold on to their own kindness. When the burden of hatred was finally set down, Della realized that inside her chest there was now a new emptiness, a space that pain had occupied before, and it was within that space that the feelings she had for August began to grow quietly and naturally, like grass and leaves reaching toward the light. But along with those feelings came an old fear still rooted deep in her heart, because the last time she had allowed herself to trust and love a man, she had been betrayed in the cruelest way a person could imagine. She went to August on a peaceful evening, and she spoke honestly to him about her fear, that she didn't know whether she could ever trust anyone again, that her heart had been wounded too deeply, and she was afraid she would never have enough courage left to give it to anyone. August listened to her with all his patience, and when she had finished speaking, he didn't rush to comfort her with solemn promises, didn't try to convince her that he was different from Clint, because he understood that trust wasn't something that could be won with words. Instead, He only told her in his deep, sincere, warm voice that he wasn't asking her to trust him right away, that he was willing to wait as long as it took, that real love wasn't something people rushed into blindly, but something built day by day, through small actions, through steadiness and honesty over the years. He said he hadn't come to save her, because he had watched her rise on her own 2 feet in that crowded banquet hall, had seen her face the people who betrayed her with a dignity even he had to respect, and that he didn't want to become a hero rescuing a helpless princess. He only wanted to stand beside her as an equal, 2 people who had both been trampled by life, and yet had still kept goodness in their hearts. Those words touched a place deep inside Della that none of Clint's sweet words had ever reached, because she recognized the fundamental difference between the 2 men. Clint had loved her for what he could take from her, for the image and convenience she provided, while August treasured her for who she truly was, for the dignity and kindness she had kept, despite everything. She understood that real love wasn't loud and showy like lavish bouquets or weddings with 200 guests. It was quiet and steady. It lived in a late-night meal set out during a snowstorm, in an old watch found again after years of being lost, in a hand held tightly through a long night in a hospital corridor. And so, slowly and carefully, like someone learning how to walk again after a grave illness, Della allowed herself to open her heart to him, not because she needed him to be saved or protected, but because for the first time in her life, she had met someone who saw her completely and loved her exactly as she was. They chose each other not in hurried passion, but through deep understanding and mutual respect. 2 wounded souls finally finding a peaceful place where they could lean on each other. 1 year after that fateful night at 2:11 in the morning, on an autumn afternoon when the trees along the distant mountains had turned a brilliant shade of gold and orange, Della stood in a small garden behind August's warm and welcoming home, wearing a simple cream-colored dress, holding in her hands a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself from the roadside. There were no 200 guests, no large speakers or showy sound system, no expensive floral arch or elaborate decorations, only a small group of people who truly loved her, a few new friends from the library where she worked, the kind neighbor who had once looked after her mother, and in the front row, in a wheelchair decorated with tiny flowers, Marin, her face radiant through tears of happiness, the mother Della had chosen to forgive and welcome back into her life. The woman standing beneath the flower arch that day was no longer the long-suffering maid from a year before, with shoulders always bent and eyes always lowered to the ground, but a woman who had learned to lift her head high, who knew that her worth was not something anyone else could grant or take away. An independent woman who had walked through the deepest reaches of betrayal and pain to find not only a true love, but also herself. When August took her hand, those hands still bearing the calluses of the old years but no longer having to soak in cold, soapy water, the 2 of them looked into each other's eyes and exchanged vows that were simple and sincere. Not empty, beautiful words, but the promises of 2 people who understood the value of honesty and respect. And in that moment, Della understood that sometimes life had to fall apart completely before one was given the chance to build something more truthful, that the worst day of her life had turned out to be the very day that saved her, pushing her out of a lie and into a truth more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream. Della's story reminds us that a person's dignity can't be taken away by anyone else, only surrendered by the person herself. That kindness given without conditions may one day return to save us when we least expect it, and that forgiveness isn't a gift we give to the one who hurt us, but the cord that frees us from the chains of the past so we can walk forward in freedom. Sometimes, the person who saves us comes from the very place we once feared and misjudged most, because the true value of a human being doesn't lie in rumors or outward appearances, but deep within the heart. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day you can hear more meaningful and deeply moving stories. How do you feel about Della's journey? And if you were her, what would you have chosen? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the sincere feelings from the depths of your heart. May all of you listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.